Hi everyone, welcome to my home and my sort of office. This is the first of our videotaped slide sets for 3105 for spring 2020. And this one's going to feel a little bit like Previously On, if you watch a TV series, because what I'm going to do is this is going to go over the last lecture or the last time we were in class together before break. And I'm going to talk a little bit about an overview of technology and human development, and then we'll look at school age development and a review of our smartphone discussion, and then move into teenagers and the developmental aspects of teenagers and touch a little bit on their technology use, and then end with the guidelines from the American Academy of Pediatrics and their recommendation on their use of the family media plan. So that's what we're going to cover in this one. I am aware that my screen covers up a small portion of the PowerPoint slide, so I can't do anything about that. But you have a copy of the slide set, so any of those words that might be blocked, you can see there and refer to on the Canvas site. Okay, so about human development, just as a reminder, in class, we were talking about that a couple of the aspects of human development is that we all develop universally. Right, so there are the 4 domains that we're studying in this class: physical development, social, cognitive, and psychological development. Those are universal across all of us, and there are normative times when we are expected to develop. Our walking, our talking, our thinking, our brain development, and that's how we can study what we call normal or average or normative developmental expectations. That said, we also develop very uniquely because we all have different DNA, and the way that our DNA is expressed is very much dependent on the context that we are in. So that combination of nature plus nurture. So while we are very unique, right, we also develop universally. And so that reminds us that when we are looking at an ecological influence, such as parent responsibility for caregiving, school influences on us, and technology, that those are part of our environment, and they can foster our development, and they can also challenge our development. And they don't work alone; they work in concert with other influences. So parents monitoring the use of technology by their children, right? The differences across age of how a 3-year-old might use technology versus how a 13-year-old might use technology. Okay. We also touched on that a lot of our recommendations, and we're going to talk about this in Module 6, about technology use by kids, has a great deal to do with their own level of involvement and engagement with their children. So the M words that I share with you about monitoring the safety, the well-being of our children, mediating, being someone to facilitate learning, to moderate or to mitigate. So when our children are under stress, when they might be exposed to violence, as parents we can moderate the exposure, to mentor, to guide, to minimize exposure to threat, and then what I would call the M there with emotional closeness. And here I have the picture that we shared in class between a child looking at a screen by themselves versus a child engaged with a caregiver who can monitor, who can mediate, who can facilitate that child's learning. Okay, and yet with the developing individual, parents must also negotiate the balance of their involvement, because one of our aims for all of us as individuals and aims for parents is that we want to give children the room for their own exploration, for their learning, for their independence and individuation. So it's kind of a delicate balancing act, because we want to take care of our children, but at the same time we don't want to smother them or stand in the way of their development. So we were talking the last time about milestones in children's development in middle childhood, and this is the age time between, say, age 5 and age 12. You can also think of it as the elementary years, and some of our developmental aspects in terms of physical development compared to the young children and compared to adolescents. It's a slower rate of body growth. Large and fine motor skills are beginning to be more developed. The brain is becoming more logical, more ordered, more if and then. Children are developing a sense of moral development. They love to categorize. They love to play games. They love, again, that sense of order and categorization and that sort of thing. And then in terms of their own social and emotional development, this is where we look at where are you likely to find children in this age group? Well, they're going to be at school, right? So they're not going to be in childcare or with their families so much. They're going to be more at school if schools are open, and with their kid at schools, they're also going to be with peers, and they're more likely to be in after-school clubs. They're going to be in summer camps, things like that. So we're going to find kids in this age group at schools, and they're going to be more likely to be with peers. And this is all healthy for their development because it strengthens their powers of socialization and also their sense of identity. Some of the aspects that technology can benefit children between 5 and 12, it can help to expose them to new ideas, raising their awareness of events and issues. They can access information when they have questions about their health, about, towards the end of middle childhood as their body starts to change. It can facilitate the communication between themselves and their friends, with family members, with grandparents. Social media can support their connection with social networks, especially if they feel isolated or marginalized. It certainly can aid in their learning through using mobile media devices for content creation, creating digital stories, playing games, things like that, and in their identity expression. And we'll see this repeated when we talk about teenagers as well. Some of the concerns that we would have in middle childhood, and here there's a list, but you can see in terms of children being distracted from homework, the possible exposure that they may have to violent images, to racism, to hate speech, the sense of isolation, the sense of social comparison. Children may experience depression. There may be passive viewing, a reduced caloric expenditure. We have a great concern in our country around childhood obesity, cyberbullying, displaced physical activity, as I mentioned, and potential challenges to sleeping depending on, what time and the exposure to screens before sleep, as well as potential exacerbation of ADHD. This was a wonderful picture that I had shared with you about, with children at this age group and possibly a little bit older. But I share it because even though, again, we were talking about, the universal aspects and a kind of a slower rate of growth, we still see such great, incredible variation in not just physical development, but also personality, social interests, interests in activity, peer relationships, things like that. So from our smartphone discussion, we were looking at, what age we would recommend the children be to get a phone or to get a smartphone. And the class pretty much centered around a younger age for just a phone to be able to, make connections, make communication, for safety, for parents to be able to engage with children, and 15 as being an older age for children to have access to the internet on their phones, to apps, and largely the class was feeling that the older age group was more important because of the level of responsibility and for the exposure and also for stronger brain growth at a teenage age, for better responsibility, for decision making, for understanding any kind of images or interactions with others that may bring potential consequences for kids. And you know, the other key point from our smartphone discussion was that a key for parents is to know their child, and parents may want to rely on a readiness checklist to know if the child can handle the responsibility. And with this, I'm going to see if I can get to the internet and share with you the, let's see, we'll just go back here. Yeah, we're just going to go back to our recording here. What I was trying to share with you, and I apologize for the blip, was the, let's go back here, sorry. There we go. Lexi had shared a link to a readiness checklist, and I have that link in Module 5 for you to look at. The other key thing with the smartphone discussion, as parents are overseeing the safe use of smartphones by their children and determining the best age for them to have a phone as compared to when it's time for them to have the responsibility to have a smartphone, is that these discussions really should be joint between the parents and the children. And as we look at the family media plan, we'll see even more on this. And then I had shared, you know, Mark had shared after the class on our smartphone debate or discussion about, you know, what he found online from Verizon. And so as we think about this ecological context of, say, the child in the center and then parents as an influence on the child, you know, we think of even wider influence in families' context from the government, from, you know, from our culture, but also from commercial entities. And so as a parent is trying to make these decisions, you know, critically, it's important for us to also consider who's around to help them make these decisions, who's influencing their children's requesting phones. And you could have a commercial site like Verizon. And here you can see, you know, for children 6 to 8 years, the first thing that comes up are pictures of phones. Now, lower on the site, you can see that there are alternatives in terms of how parents can establish, you know, connections or controls on the phones and filters and, you know, things like that. But if the first thing that a parent sees is, you know, a picture of the phones, it could encourage them to think, oh, for a 6 to 8-year-old, having a smartphone is perfectly acceptable. So the recommendations from the American Academy of Pediatrics related to the use of phones by use of technology by children and teens. And here you can see this list, and I've highlighted some of the key words, right? A balance, and this is knowing your child. How can you help the child balance their use of phones with what you also know is necessary for their physical development, their cognitive development, their social development. So you want to help them have, say, access to their family and friends, and that's a positive thing. But on the other hand, is it risk? Is it worth the potential risk of their becoming so addicted to multiple types of social media that they're not interested in going outside and playing? Looking at how setting limits, monitoring again for well-being, especially for parents to be a good role model, right? Not just do as I say, but also do as I do, and being very well aware of the kind of roles that parents are setting by their own use of technology. For parents to promote the value of face-to-face communication, provide safety warnings about safety, for parents to be aware, focus on quality of engagement between parents and children, but also the quality of engagement, say, around school activities or with peers, to make and communicate media plans with all family members, and we'll take a look at that, and then to also understand the potential limits and the harms. Now with adolescents, so as we move up the developmental age scale, now we're talking about kids between the ages of, say, 12 to 18. And this is such an incredibly dynamic period of human development that researchers who study adolescence even break it down into separate age groups. So there's early adolescence, middle adolescence, and later adolescence, because what is going on, say, between a 12, 13, 14-year-old is so dramatically different than what's going on in the body, in the mind, in identity and responsibility and context and everything of, say, a 17, 18, 19-year-old. That they deserve their own pieces of research. So we have a variety, you can see here on this slide, a variety of things that are going on in terms of physical changes, of course, puberty being key one, and with that comes, racing hormones, interest in sex, interest in dating, and also, but the brain is still forming, right? So there are parts of the brain, and there are parts of the brain that will, not be able to regulate, say, impulses. And so during this age period when kids are very interested in developing their own identity separate from the family, when, that they may be very, very open to risk taking. And so that could mean, to the horrors of many parents, right, exposure to drugs and sex and changing your hair color and getting tattoos and piercings and, crazy stuff. So this is what can bring parents a sense of tension. And again, that delicate balance of wanting to protect your child, but at the same time wanting to give them room for growth. And we also think about the context that teenagers are in. And again, unlike the kids 6 to 12, they're much more likely to have jobs, to be independent, our society looks to teenagers to have more responsibility. And we are also looking at teenagers in their life beyond being teenagers. So we know that they're also thinking about college, or they're thinking about going into the military, or what jobs, they'll continue to have. And also then this can impact the parent-child relationship, depending on how comfortable parents have for, again, the things we've talked about before with families, with communication, the sense of connectedness, and being able to flex as they respond to the individual developmental needs of the teenagers. So, and I had shared this from the Search Institute. So they too, looking at all of the research related to healthy development in teenagehood or in adolescence, identified these developmental tasks of adolescence. So we take those multiple domains, and here they've identified them, in what, 3, 6, about 12 different tasks. And they're, again, they're very, very similar. But then looking specifically about technology use, one is we look at just the actual use and use differences, say, between teenagers and younger kids. And so generally teenagers will spend more time with screens and with media overall. And they're, while some of them may continue to, say, play games online or play games with computers, they're more likely to use them for more academic pursuits, for more social networking, and maybe for work. So their use of technology is going to be more reflective of their developmental context. So some of the benefits in these, again, very much echo what we were looking at with kids in school age. Exposure to new ideas, their ability to collaborate with others, that idea that you can be very creative, collaborative, you can do self-expression, create digital stories. Some of the research is suggesting it may lead to some improvement in IQ relative to learning and interactive game playing. I had shared this slide as well. There is increasing research that is interested in what's called connected learning, or looking at how youth are using technology beyond the classroom, very obviously as they use technology in their real life to foster and to facilitate and further their own interests. So in my example here of, say, Liam, and you'll meet Liam, but Liam has an interest in music. And so that's something that he might engage in to some extent in the classroom, but outside of the classroom, he's going to continue to be interested in music, and he's going to continue to use technology to foster his interest in music. And so his relationship with his father will facilitate his use of technology, because his father might be exposing him to new applications. He might facilitate by purchasing some materials for him, whatever. And the family's shared interest in Star Wars would take them, say, to a convention, and there the father will tweet out to somebody who is in the music community and again foster and facilitate Liam's interest. So this idea about how we are using technology to really connect children's and teens' learning interests beyond the classroom. They may be complemented in the classroom, but the real interest is beyond the classroom. Some of the questions, as we currently are using virtual technology to continue our learning at the University of Minnesota, these same questions are really promoting our use of technology in high school classrooms. And so again, the idea is balance. We want to continue learning effectively. That may or may not include technology, but we need to continue doing research to know what that is. Some of the psychological and social benefits, again, connectivity, communication with family and friends, using technology to support networks, especially for kids that may be isolated and marginalized. And yet, one of our, from the flip side then, we know that technology for adolescents can pose a potential challenge. If you were in class when we were doing this slide set, we were talking about teens. I had also shared a couple links of videos from Common Sense Media where they had interviewed teenagers. And by their own admission, kids were talking about spending a lot of time online, that the social comparison that they were experiencing was leading to a sense of depression sometimes, that sometimes because their friends were so much using technology, they just longed for that opportunity to go outside and play basketball, but maybe, their friends weren't into it. And so, one thing I would ask you to think of is, while there are all these potential benefits, what might be some potential challenges to teenagers as they're growing up? So what was the problem? How did technology contribute to the problem? What was the consequence of that problem? How did parents respond to it? And was there a resolution to it? Even challenges to development, oftentimes the way that they're resolved or some resolution still fosters some aspect of development, from learning, from problem solving, from decision making, from, whatever the resolution was that the person encountered. So some of the other potential concerns, and again, a lot of these are continued on from our interest with 6 to 12-year-olds, has to do with learning, distraction, possibly exposure sexting, having boys and girls, young boys and girls in teenagehood, be preyed on by predators. There is an internet gaming disorder from excessive use, privacy, again, problems with potential on obesity and sleep. I have a link here for social media impacts, multitasking. We think that we're better about, getting a lot of things done when we can multitask, but in fact, we don't do them as successfully. And this is a slide just on the internet gaming disorder, and if you looked in the DSM-5, some of the characteristics: giving up other activities, losing interest, continuing to game despite seeing problems, using gaming to relieve negative moods such as guilt and hopelessness. And I would be very, very interested if any of you know of anybody who has experienced internet gaming disorder, and especially, what it's meant for them with regard to consequences, but I'm particularly interested in treatment. And then, you know, we talked very briefly about cyberbullying, and here's a scenario. So you take a second to read it. We have Bonnie, who is concerned about this Lindsay who's moved in. And our focus is on Lindsay, who is the newcomer. And because the other kids kind of gang up on her through using social media, she, you know, experiences a lot of painful posts, and she suffers from depression and eventually a lack of interest in doing anything, including going to school. So this is not that unusual of a scenario. In fact, when we talked about this in class, it was Emma, I believe it was, you know, mentioned that she had experienced something very similar. And so when this is the reality and this is the potential consequence of you know, teenagers going online, you know, to intervene or to help, we need to step back and really ask, you know, who is the victim here? Who is the bully? But how does this affect the development of teens? And we're thinking about psychological development. We're talking about social development, and not just the psychological and social development of the girl here, the Lindsay girl who might be the victim, but what about the girls who are the perpetrators? You know, what does this mean in terms of their own sense of execution of power in their own social dynamic and their own expression of identity if they are using technology in this way? And then who's to blame? If this was to escalate and something happens to Lindsay, right? If she exhibits self-harm, you know, who's to blame her? Is it the parents? Is it Lindsay's own parents who are monitoring what she's doing? If this started in the school grounds, you know, is the school culpable? And so this is a real issue in our society now when we talk about sort of the lack of boundaries, the lack of physical boundaries with the internet, because it's very easy for people to back off and say, not my problem, right? Because it didn't happen in my house, it didn't happen in my school. And yet, the technology is out there and makes it so easy for kids to post anonymously, to gang up, to create websites, to create Facebook accounts, TikTok accounts, and really make life hell for other kids. So I think this is a really critical thing that we consider as a society, and what is it that we are really teaching kids and teaching parents and teaching teachers and everybody else who, you know, interacts with kids about the impact of bullying. And then finally come back to the recommendations by the American Academy of Pediatrics. And, you know, there's, while places like Common Sense Media that I've shared with you and others are now making more concrete recommendations for by, you know, kids in middle school, kids in middle childhood, and then kids who are teenagers, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the reading that we had for this week really just is very global. But still, the recommendations, I think, are really appropriate if you are a parent, and if you are a teenager and you are reading through, is to seek a healthy balance, look for good role models, be very concerned about, you know, safety, you know, and to understand the potential limits and the harms. And finally, I'm going to end here with the American Academy of Pediatrics Family Media Plan. And I would recommend that you look into this. I think as one of the blog post recommendations, you can go into this, you can create a simulated family. And what I would really encourage you to do is to look at those recommendations and see, if this was your family, if this was you when you were 8 or your younger brothers or sisters, how easy would they be to keep up? And what is the usefulness of this tool, say, for family communication around the use of technology? Even if you don't use it religiously and use it as a plan that the family adheres to, sometimes platforms like this can be very, very useful just to open up dialogue. And they can be very, very helpful for parents to give them guidance on what do we talk about. You know, technology seems so overwhelming. Well, if I'm going to sit with my 8-year-old, I'm going to sit with my 12-year-old, I'm going to sit with my 16-year-old, or all three of them together as a family for us to make plans about what is their safe and effective use of technology, this gives me some guidance that maybe I wouldn't have known on my own. So again, I would recommend that you go into the AAP's family media plan. It allows you to, create the ages of the children. You can name them, and then you go through and you click boxes of what, as between you and your child, you believe would be something that you would want to follow. So, create that and see if it's useful. So we'll stop there. So that's school-age kids, teenage kids. We're just scratching the surface on this. There's a whole bunch of links that I've provided to you in the Canvas site that I would encourage you to take a look at. There is new research on these age groups coming out all the time. When we think again across big developmental domains, and then we think about social development of 6- and 7-year-old girls, right? We think about physical development of 12-year-old African-American boys who live in Northwest. So there is so much ongoing research in all of these areas. We really have just scratched the surface with looking at what those domains are, what are some of our developmental hopes for the different age groups, and then what are some of the positives that technology can bring to fostering development in school-age children and in adolescents, and what are some of the potential consequences. And especially because, again, this is a family course, we continue to come back to what is the role of the family in monitoring, mediating, mentoring, providing emotional closeness, keeping open the lines of communication so that as a family, this technology can be used in a safe and healthy way. So with that, I will say goodbye until the next screencast video.